Security Network's first interview in the series, Fighting for Freedom, The Journey Towards Peace and Democracy, a series dedicated to individuals whose inspiring work has facilitated liberation movements and advocated for peace. In our first interview, we are delighted to invite Henning Melber, now living in Sweden, who is strongly influenced by his German and Namibian socialization. As a son of German immigrants to Namibia, he joined the SWAPO liberation movement in 1974. Post-independence, he became the director of the Namibian Economic Policy Research Unit in Windhoek, subsequently in 2000 relocating as research director to the Nordic Africa Institute in Uppsala, to which he remains associated today. He's an extraordinary professor at the University of Pretoria and for the Center of Gender and Africa Studies at the University of Free State in Bloemfontein. Furthermore, his scholarly work and advocacy are deeply rooted in the socio-political landscapes of Namibia, Southern Africa, and the complexities of liberation movements transitioning into governance, while also exploring themes of German colonialism, racism, global governance, and the dynamics of asymmetric power relations. As a scholar, activist, and public intellectual, Henning Melber is seeking to advance social justice and foster critical dialogues on pertinent issues today. Welcome, Henning. How are you today?
Thank you very much, Pia, and it's nice talking to you, but one should not get too much credit for just trying to be a decent human being.
Can you describe your early life, including your upbringing, moving to Namibia, and your initial impressions of the country and its people during that time?
I was born in West Germany in 1950, and my mother immigrated with me and my younger brother to then Southwest Africa in the mid-1960s. At a time when we were just starting to be aware of the Beat generation, celebrating the Beatles, the Who, the Rolling Stones, and there we end up in Africa. And it was a strange world, despite the fact that we became part of a German-speaking white community in then Southwest Africa, nowadays Namibia, having a rather privileged upbringing there, based on white supremacy, based on apartheid, and actually hardly aware what was going on in the majority of the people who are living under apartheid for being Black. And it took some time to realize that this is a very strange world, despite the fact that I thought right at the beginning this is somehow strange, because I was in good shape. I was a successful athlete, and upon arrival at the airport in Windhoek, I was expected to allow a Black person to carry my suitcase, which was against all of my habits. And when I resisted that my suitcase was carried by a Black person, my stepfather awaiting us at the airport got very upset and angry, because he tried to tell me that this is the way of daily life in the then still settler colonial reality of Southwest Africa. So that made me a bit like a stranger right from the beginning. And German immigrants were by the German-speaking white community in Southwest Africa met with suspicion. And I do understand now why, because I was one of those who made them suspicious in my mindset, despite not being political at all, but just having a feeling of what is supposed to be a proper human interaction, which did not take place in that settler colonial society. So right from the beginning, we were labeled the cherries, referring to coming from Germany. And we remained to a large extent the cherries, the outsiders all the time. And I think that was one of the lessons looking back, that being marginalized from the own community because of where you came from was actually making you sensible for being marginalized generally, for a degree of otherness. And we were attached a degree of otherness despite speaking the same German language, despite looking alike, And that was a moment which I also picked up in conversations with the few others who joined anti-colonial movements as whites, who realized a kind of estrangement in their own community, which actually was a starting point for gradually developing a sense of what is just and what is unjust, and then finally taking sides in favor of what we considered being just.
So is this why you would say you joined the SWAPO liberation movement?
Well, it took several years before I joined the liberation movement. And it took several years before I matured in a way that I would be willing to join the liberation movement, which, by the way, was actually, strictly speaking, not my decision. It was the decision of some Black friends, which I had in the meantime. By the early 1970s, I got into contact with some Black peers, my age group. And by 1974, they asked me, why on earth are you not yet a member of SWAPO? And I looked at them and I said, is that possible? Because I was, of course, socialized and ideologically indoctrinated by the white minority regime that SWAPO is a black terrorist movement, anti-white. So one of my friends looked back at me and smiled. He was a regional local SWAPO coordinator, put a hand in the pocket, brought out a card, borrowed a pen from me, wrote my name on the card, handed it over and said, yes, it is possible. That was the moment I ended up in 1974, more than 50 years ago, as a SWAPO member.
And what was your role within this movement?
Well, first of all, the role was to learn and to listen. I
Interesting.
think it was a strange environment. I mean, there were no other whites in SWAPO.
Hmm.
We never interacted on common grounds. We always were forced to interact in an imposed hierarchical relationship.
Hmm.
So learning what it means to act among others considered to be equals was a task, was a challenge. And not only for me, also for my peers, Black peers, who all of a sudden interacted with me not as the boss or little master, but as someone who is like them, a member of SWAPO. And it also had, as a side effect, a learning process, how you act without being racist or patronizing or paternalistic.
Hmm.
Because realizing in the beginning that I was tempted to never object, always agree with what my comrade said, despite the fact that occasionally I had a different opinion. Ultimately, as I became aware, is another form of not taking the other serious.
Hmm.
So you had to learn to stand by your views, which does not mean that you dismiss the other, but actually, strictly speaking, means you recognize the other because you take him or her serious and share your views, even if these are dissenting views. That you engage in a dialogue, no matter how they look, no matter how they think. So that was, looking back, part of the learning process. And it took me some time to feel comfortable enough, relaxed enough to be and to share what I think I am and what I was thinking. And that was maybe one of the important lessons for me, which became quite a strong factor in the way I try to interact with other people, independent how they look and what they think.
How were you received as one of the few white people within the liberation movement?
Well, those who made me a SWAPO member, of course, they celebrated it like a success story.
Yeah.
Many others looked at me with suspicion. They didn't know me. There were the suspicions, maybe this is an agent on behalf of the South Africans. Those were there. They didn't necessarily had a white pigmentation, but agents and spies were a common issue in anti-colonial movements. So
Oh,
there
wow.
was a bit of suspicion. Who is that? How can we deal with him? And there was not actually before that a principled political decision that whites could become members of SWAPO. As I described it, it happened by accident. And a year later, actually, a local congress in Namibia of SWAPO raised the issue if whites actually can become members of SWAPO. And they agreed, yes, of course. SWAPO is not a racist movement, and everyone who shares the same goals and identifies with the struggle should be entitled to join the organization. So a year later, in retrospect, it was agreed locally, of course, whites can become member. There was another one who at almost the same time, a white British of roots British who had joined SWAPO. So the two of us were the cases where the comrades scratched their heads and said, okay, what we did is that actually okay. And then that Congress said, yes, it's okay. But I also know that afterwards, especially when I was exiled as from 1975, that the SWAPO leadership in exile raised the issue, who is that guy? Can we trust him? And how do we handle him? I know that was an issue, which I learned later only. And I also learned that the only female member of the Central Committee, who I really admire, stood up and said, what are you talking about? Of course we can trust him. His skin color has nothing to do with his convictions. And it made me aware of another thing, which I generally believe is true, that there is a certain affinity between gender and empathy. Not every woman has more emotions and more empathy than men, but in tendency, I strongly believe that women tend to have a much higher degree of empathy and compassion and sympathy than men have. Because, and that's also a signifier, I think, of anti-colonial struggles. They happen to be a male chauvinist affair because they are infected in an almost toxic way by a military mindset.
Mhm.
And one could say necessarily so, because if you do not operate in the underground and in the anti-colonial struggle with a military mindset, you have lost the fight before you really started it. But that is one of the sad legacies of the struggle, that at the time when you consider your struggle successful, replacing the colonial oppressor by the so-called liberators, you have adjusted your mindset by means of a struggle mentality to an extent that we unfortunately reproduce a lot of those substantial elements of colonial oppression against which we were fighting. And you can see that until the very day in the way former liberation movements as governments run the countries and have a we-they divide where they say, if you're not with us, you are against us. It's a very strict hierarchical mindset, and it is indeed reproducing elements of a colonial system.
Interesting. That was actually my next question was how did gender dynamics play out within the liberation movement? How were women involved in leadership roles? And if so, how were they treated or perceived? Like I know your perception of women within the liberation movement, but at the time, how was it with your peers?
I know a little bit of the situation in exile. And a lot of women who went into exile and were in the refugee camps, they were fulfilling the very traditional roles. A few of them went to military training and they also became fighters in the guerrilla struggle. But usually they were cooking, they were preparing the food, they were doing the washing for the male comrades, and even more, they were the sexual objects. And they were abused. Strictly speaking, they were abused. And if they dared to enter relationships with local men, they were punished for that. While the male comrades, of course, were absolutely free to enter whatever relationships with women, be they Namibian or otherwise, as they liked. And it was really something where the women were still confined to very traditional roles, even in their situation of having joined a liberation struggle. The interesting thing is, and there is a Namibian female scholar who did interviews with women who were in exile in the refugee camps. They still coming back to Namibia and were forced back into the local Namibian traditional roles, considered their experiences in exile in the refugee camps as liberating. And I thought that's a very interesting insight because they were back home in Namibia after independence, confined to traditional roles, which were actually, in their view, less liberating than the relative freedom they had in the refugee camps, which is another sobering part of what is maybe misconceived as post-colonial realities. I say misconceived because there is a flippant remark attached to Mahmoud Mamdani, the Ugandan social scientist, who people say once in a panel debate a bit flippantly said, the only post-colonial I know is the post office. And what it means is, of course, exactly the point I already stressed earlier, that in the so-called liberated post-colonial societies, we reproduce colonial patterns of power and dominance, only that those who are in government look alike as the majority of the people. But the mindset is to some extent infected by colonial hierarchical power mentalities.
I agree. I agree. I think also, particularly in Africa, a lot of our institutions, a lot of our systems, even, education, are Western imports that are not necessarily suited to the socioeconomic needs that we have. Taking this into consideration, could you share any anecdotes or stories that illustrate the resilience and the spirit of resistance among the Namibian people during their liberation struggle?
Well, I still remember one story which I really much liked. I was, for the last time before being refused re-entry to Namibia and South Africa, back home in 1975 with a task for SWAPO. And I was traveling through parts of the country in the company of two comrades. And they were driving and we were chatting. And every time we passed an interesting building or something else which was nice, they said, this will be ours after independence. And that was a fun story throughout our travels. And I really liked that so much because it was this lighter way of showing resilience and this forward-looking attitude. not complaining about the oppression, but basically turning it around and say, oh, look, there's another nice villa and it will be ours after independence. So kind of that is one of the stories I always kept in mind because I think, it remembers me of this final song of this Monty Python film where they are at the crosses and they sing, always look at the bright side of life. And that is something I could witness so many times, and until the very day I can witness among people who face exploitation, oppression, discrimination, be it by the former white minority regime or now by the blacks. For many of them, the situation has only shifted in nuances gradually, but fundamental principles of discrimination and oppression and humiliation still are alive. And they always keep this positive attitude, this resilience to make the best out of nothing. And that I could discover already during the struggle days, that you had this on the ground, that people were basically resisting by not giving in, not feeling pity for themselves, which is, I think, another form of resistance. We refuse to be victimized by you. We look at things differently.
I love that you actually recognize and that you say that because I see that as well. Even here, like in South Africa, we have our issues, we have our grievances, but even if you see, people going through the hardest of times, they will still find a way to make light of it and have a bit of a positive outlook on it. So I think it's really interesting that you recognize that. And I like the anecdote of this will belong to us after independence. Um, the 70s and the 80s were incredibly violent in South Africa. On the one hand, to a certain degree, in the form of resistance, but primarily in terms of state violence. Was this the case in Namibia as well? What was your impression?
Namibia was different. That had to do with the legal status of Namibia. Namibia became a mandate after the First World War, which was transferred to the then Union of South Africa. And while General Smuts said mandate means annexation except the name, Namibia was always initially a trust which South Africa had to report on to the United Nations. And when they stopped early in the formation of the United Nations, before that, the League of Nations, to report back on the mandate, it was considered a betrayal of the trust. So the United Nations also in the 60s published a booklet on Namibia, which was entitled A Trust Betrayed. So given that it had a kind of an international legal status, even if disrespected by South Africa, they were very careful to what extent they could go in violation of that international legal status, which means SWAPO was never officially prohibited.
Okay.
That's why I could become a SWAPO member in Namibia at public daylight. That's why they discussed a year later at a conference if whites can become members. All of that was possible in Namibia, which does not mean there was no oppression. There was no political prosecution. One of the most renowned Namibian patriots, Andimba Toivo Yatoivo, served more than 20 years on Robben Island as a political prisoner. So we had a lot of Namibian SWAPO members who were caught and sentenced and then put on Robben Island.
Mm.
It's not that there was freedom. Many were tortured, others were killed, many were imprisoned. But still, you could operate in Namibia as SWAPO all the time with the risks attached and with being spied and followed and intimidated. But that was a major difference. And the degree of violence played out mainly in the so-called border war in the north of Namibia, in the region bordering to Angola, where then the South African army also invaded southern Angola. That was a bloody, inhuman border war. And there was state of emergency in northern Namibia, where people could not move freely for decades because it was occupied physically by the South African army. But the rest of the territory was kind of, well, if I say more liberal, that sounds silly because there was no liberalism. But you had a certain limited freedom of movement where you could also organize, where you could meet, you could use church congregations to come together. The contract workers were organized in trade unions. They embarked on a national strike in the early 1970s. So there were forms of resistance which did not lead to mass killings as it was the case in South Africa.
Mm.
And the biggest event of mass killings was when the residents of the so-called old location, at the time in the late 1950s, the biggest settlement of blacks, it was the location or the township outside of Windhoek or nearby Windhoek, when they resisted forced removal. And that escalated in December 1959 in a clash where 11 or 12 of those unarmed demonstrators were killed by the police. That was a few months before Sharpeville, and that was the biggest massacre in the Namibian history. And it puts it a bit into the perspective, at least numerically, if 12 killed by the police is the biggest massacre in the Namibian history of the anti-colonial struggle, which was basically the formative stage of the national resistance movement.
So did your work with the SWAPO liberation movement extend to other countries where the scenes of the ANC and SWAPO merged?
Well, at times, living back in West Germany, SWAPO felt it would make sense if I represent SWAPO, especially in West Germany at gatherings where, much to the people, I caused frustration. They wanted to see a black comrade say, "Aluta continua." And there came a white guy with actually a clear German local accent when he spoke, which was a kind of a disappointment, which also was for me an interesting observation, which sensitized me even further that racism comes in many different forms. Because they found it difficult, if not impossible, to accept that a black liberation movement is represented by someone who was born in Germany and speaks a local German accent. That was very interesting. And I always followed with amusement when we were moving in delegations in Germany that they demonstratively hugged and embraced the black comrades, but never me, which I found very interesting. And I didn't mind. I thought actually, yeah, that's quite appropriate. But it showed this kind of, this subconscious classification of people. So for them, I was not a proper liberation fighter. I could not, their imagination. But then we had international conferences where occasionally I was part of. I attended a hearing at the United Nations in New York in 1984. And was introduced as a white member of SWAPO. So SWAPO also made a point by referring to the few of us and saying, we are not racist, we are not against the whites, because there are whites who are members of the organization. But let me put it into perspective. The ANC had, relatively speaking, many more white activists than SWAPO had. We were basically always just a handful.
So you had mentioned that you were banned from entering Namibia and South Africa. I researched it and you were banned from 1975 to 1989 and 1993 in South Africa. Why exactly were you banned and how did you feel being banned from what I assume you perceived was your home at the time? And how did it impact your involvement in the movement?
I had mentioned that I was in 1975 in Namibia to look into matters for SWAPO. They related to education because that was a time when thousands of young Namibians left for independent Angola to get further education through the refugee camps by SWAPO. And my task was actually to explore if there are means to establish alternative education at some places in Namibia that not everyone leaves. You don't want to have everyone leaving the country and then leave it over to the white minority. So that was my task, but it was misunderstood, obviously, as I found out later, that I was sent to Namibia to prepare the armed struggle in the country, which I found very flattering afterwards, that I said, oh my God, it kind of reproduced this racist mindset that you needed a white brain behind the blacks, you know. I mean, it was so far from reality, but I later could reconstruct. It must have happened by a meeting I had at a theological seminar with black students outside of Windhoek in the countryside, where they were eager to learn from me a lot of things. And we were discussing, among others, experiences of liberation struggles elsewhere. And I talked about the Tupamaro in Latin America and what are the strategies to prepare guerrilla warfare as an abstract issue. And obviously, someone sitting there reported back about that meeting. And that must have contributed to this weird idea that I was there to prepare the armed struggle. And that obviously motivated the decision that if I should return again, only they would allow me back to keep me. Because a friend of mine who was living in Pretoria and who I had met before I left in 75, he was arrested afterwards. And he then, through his brother, managed to send me a message that he was specifically interrogated about me. And the questions implied exactly this, that they accused me of having been sent to Namibia to prepare the armed struggle. And he said, even if they would allow you back, please don't come back. They would only want to get hold of you. So I didn't try that until my younger brother died in 79. And I wanted to be back for the funeral to stay at the side of my mother, and I was refused entry. And that confirmed basically that there is no way to come back. And when in 1988, a year before the United Nations transition was implemented in Namibia, the West German Teachers Trade Union wanted to visit South Africa and Namibia. And having me as a member of the delegation, because at the time I had prepared handouts under the title Education Against Apartheid, the South Africans informed the German trade union that they are welcome to visit South Africa and Namibia on the condition that I'm not part of the delegation. And then the West German trade union said, thank you, but no, thank you. So that delegation did not visit. They visited then after independence, and I welcomed them when I was back in Windhoek. But the funny thing is, I think they just overlooked me in the computers. Because when in December 1992, I was supposed to pass through South Africa as part of a delegation attending the Third African Population Conference in Senegal, and we wanted to stay overnight in Pretoria or Johannesburg, at the entry point, the official said, you're not allowed to enter South Africa. And I said, you must be joking. Mandela is free. All of the ANC are back. And you're saying I'm not allowed to enter? And he was a bit feeling awkward, I could see. And he said, well, you're a banned person for South Africa, which also then motivated the head of the delegation to stand up and come forward and said, then nobody of us will enter your country. which was easy to be said because our connecting flight was the next morning, and at Johannesburg International Airport was this hotel in the transit. So we just went up and slept overnight in that hotel instead of a hotel in Pretoria or Johannesburg. But I think, yeah, but that's how it all happened. And I was then applying in Windhoek that the restrictions are lifted. And a few months later, I think in March or April 93, I got a letter I had to pick up from the from the South African embassy in Windhoek, from Home Affairs in South Africa, which said, "Sir, we herewith inform you that the restrictions have been lifted," with a signature, which was very funny. I kept that letter and I think I have it somewhere.
Did it affect your family in any way, you being banned, or like were they persecuted for your activism?
Well, it affected my mother, of course.
Mm.
It affected her in a way that she tried to understand, and she managed to understand. And I made reference to this friend who I visited on the way in Pretoria in 75. And his mother happened to live together with my mother in the same coastal town of Swakopmund.
Oh,
And my mother then told me, and we were the only two whites in the country who had such a history. She informed me they occasionally were walking along the beach and talking about their lost sons, which gave me some comfort because it meant my mom was not alone.
mm.
And my mom developed, among others, a feminist awareness and became a feminist activist in settler colonial Namibia, which I thought corresponded very well with my own changes. And she was actually very proud of having that son who stood up.
I love that. So we see liberation movements continue, and particularly in the global south, being led primarily by youth. With some liberation movements that we see today, I see a certain degree of hopelessness given the length of the fight for equality and the continued double standards that we see, particularly when it comes to the liberation of people of color. Was there a time where you shared such hopelessness, where you thought we will never achieve freedom and the freedom and the liberation that we deserve?
No.
Never?
There is this saying, hope dies last. And you asked me earlier about my Namibianness. Being restricted from returning to Namibia made me more Namibian than anything else. It was the decisive turning point. I'm often wondering if I would have been able to return, would I have decided to spend the rest of my life in Namibia? Many of my classmates, they are somewhere in Europe or elsewhere. They left Namibia. The decision that I'm not allowed to live in Namibia made me more Namibian than anything else because it nurtured my desire to have the right to return and to live there in a place I by then considered my home. And that nurtured also the hope that one day this will happen. There were setbacks. We had hopes in the late 1970s with the Geneva Conference that very soon we are allowed to organize elections like in Zimbabwe in 1980. They were scattered. Then there were other hopes scattered. So there were numerous occasions where I thought, now. And now did not happen. But then you basically moved on with the strengths, but then the next time. So it was never to give up. No, I mean, this is your ultimate goal. You are not abandoning your ultimate goal. If you have your own personal desires and goals, even despite all the setbacks, you will not abandon them. And I think that's exactly the spirit that was motivating the struggles for self-determination and liberation. And it was the motivation for all the others. And this is why these liberation struggles all over the world finally, in the end, in most cases, were successful, at least to some extent successful. We discussed what I would call the limits to liberation, but in the sense that Namibia nowadays is governed by a democratically elected government, which is the former Liberation Party, and that the people have the liberty to make political choices, which, as we see in South Africa, can result in a different government, which, as we see in the case of Mozambique, if denied, it can result in another conflict bordering to civil unrest and war. But that is basically a stage in the liberation struggle beyond white minority rule. And to that extent, this old slogan, "A luta continua," the struggle continues, is still applicable. The struggle is not ending. The struggle shifts. But social resistance, the fight for self-determination, also in the sense of individual freedoms, of more justice, more social fairness, more equality, is an ongoing uphill battle. But again, it's nourished by the hope that we should do better, and if we are consistent enough and not giving up, we could do better. And I think that's very important. And that would mean to replace the wrong translation of "a luta continua," which is understood as the looting continues, into true liberation in the sense that governance serves the interest of the majority of the people. Our slogan before independence in SWAPO was solidarity, freedom, justice. Looking at Namibia today, the society lacks solidarity with the wretched of the earth, who continue to remain the majority. They don't have a freedom beyond the legal rights of civil liberties, which many of them even don't are aware of, because they don't know the Constitution. And even if they would know their civil liberties, they would not have the material means to access courts to seek justice. And that means also that justice is a relative term. So you could say the struggle slogan of solidarity, freedom, justice has been partially implemented and benefits a new elite, which is rubbing shoulders with an old elite. That's not true liberation.
I think what you described early on in your response, we see particularly exemplified that the fact that you were banned made you more Namibian, made you want to go home more than anything. I think we see it exemplified now, particularly with the population of Gaza, who, despite the complete annihilation and destruction, are willing and wanting to go home. And I think that is how you truly also identify if someone truly belongs to that place, that area. Someone who fights for the well-being of their home. Moving beyond that, you reminded me in our conversation of Manenberg and Cape Jazz. Now, during independence and freedom movements, the arts were particularly used in defiance of state repression, as well as a way to cope, I suppose, with the abuses that were and the repression that was being conducted. So I wanted to ask, but was this your impression in Namibia as well? Did you see the arts being used in what form and shape?
It's a very striking observation you share with me, and it moves me actually emotionally very much on several levels. Manenberg is where it's happening, I remember, as the LP, then still by Dollar Brand, not Abdullah Ibrahim, which resonates with this claim of this is our home. And this is where we stay. And your reference to the Palestinian people who are determined to return to build a new life on the ruins of total destruction is reproducing the same resilience, the same claim of identity, which is rooted and anchored in a location, in a physical place. This is home. And nobody manages to deny your home. Even if you destroy the infrastructure, it remains the home. They are willing to build tents on the ruins of their houses. Now, that is such a powerful manifestation. And to some extent, while not as drastic and radical, that applied also to the demolition of shacks, to invading the townships, destroying the little infrastructure that was there. It still meant this is our home, and you are not allowed to take away our home. It has to do with identity.
Mm.
We don't allow you to rob us of our identity. Now, you asked about the role of art in Namibia. Again, Namibia is a very different place from South Africa, demographically, in the long history of culture, education. It was not by coincidence considered a fifth province of South Africa. And I remember times where our comrades in the ANC visibly looked down on us as the peasant comrades from this fifth province. So while art played a significant role, you can't compare it with what you just used, like the vibrant art in Sophiatown, in Monenberg, whatever the places were where you had long history. I only think about the jazz music of South Africa, which has a century-long tradition of artists like Miriam Makeba, and you name them. We didn't have a Miriam Makeba in Namibia. Namibia has just now reached the threshold of 3 million inhabitants, and independent just 1 million inhabitants in a country of 840,000 square kilometers. You had not the urban cooking melting pot, which you had in Cape Town, in the Burkaap, or whatever places come to your mind. Nothing of that existed in Namibia, which means there was much less fertile ground for artistic expressions. But there were township bands. I made reference to the old location, which was then closed in the mid-1960s. The old location had cultivated on the weekends dancing events. They had numerous local bands. They were mushrooming. They celebrated Coon Carnival. They had a kind of humor which reminded me of South African features I came across. They had a band leader. His name was Warmgat. And I mean, can you imagine a band leader who calls himself Warmgat in the late 1950s? And you had all these kind of things which you could also describe as a form of resistance and resilience. They were celebrating their own local culture, and they had the dancing events, they had soccer tournaments, they had Coon Carnival. So yes, that existed. And I remember there was one band at the time when I joined SWAPO, they were called the Ugly Creatures. I mean, that's another form of resistance. Call yourself as a black band Ugly Creatures. Come on. I mean, honestly, how harakat can you be? I mean, and they were so extremely popular. And they were touring, and they were, until the very day, those who are still alive from that band They are celebrated like local heroes. They were members of the ugly creatures. So we had that too, but of course not in that so visible and so eloquent form as in South Africa.
Okay. Do you have any seeds of hope for those who are still continuing the liberation movement or movement against colonialism, apartheid, genocide? Do you have advice for young people who are still engaged in the struggle, things that you wish you knew at the time?
Generally speaking, we are having this conversation at a time where it looks very bleak. We have not managed to reduce oppression. We have not managed to reduce white supremacist claims. That's a very sad experience, which for me is emotionally very difficult to acknowledge and to face. I think what I would like to see in the generations that continue the struggle, which they should never give up hope, to be aware of the pitfalls we also already talked about earlier of the struggle. A German novelist once said a sentence which I kept in mind. It says, "War shapes its people."
Mm.
And it relates to what we discussed earlier, that entering a struggle against oppressive structures faces the risk that you internalize a mindset which reproduces oppressive structures.
Mm.
And that's the pitfalls everyone engaged in resistance should be aware of. And it also requires self-critical reflections. Where do I enter the risk to reproduce oppressive behavior, if only out of frustration? Where do I risk to take over modes of thinking which are not liberating, but in disguise continue to cultivate oppression, marginalization of others? So I think that would be for me one of the lessons I would like to pass on to others who are younger. Be aware of the traps and the pitfalls. That you engage, even often at personal risk, in resistance, does not by definition make you a better person. You are a better person if you are willing to accept the limitations we all have in our socialization and are willing to self-critically reflect, where can we do better?
So, in the recent elections in Southern Africa, the parties that led the democratic transition and liberation movements, whether in Namibia, South Africa, Botswana, Mozambique, have for the first time since independence lost considerable support from the people. Why do you think this is? Would you attribute it to what you say is reproduction of similar repressive sort of perspectives and views of governance?
I think there are several factors, and they have to do with the time that has passed since the change in government towards a black majority government. First of all, the era where the cultivation of patriotic history is a decisive element in casting a vote is past.
Mm.
The demographic changes mean that now you have the born free as a majority of the electorate. Welcome to the club. And the born free are not impressed by a historical record which says, we liberated you, you owe us. they apply a different measurement. For them, a main criteria is, are you delivering now as government in political power? You might have liberated our fathers and mothers and grandfathers and grandmothers, and they had all the right to appreciate that, your sacrifices, and to give you a vote as a kind of a bonus vote. Why should we?
Mm.
If you do not deliver public utilities, if you do not create employment, if you allow us education, but then we end up on the streets because no one employs us. If all of these things happen, which make some of us feel, or even our parents sometimes in their bitterness, say we were better off under apartheid.
Mm.
Why then would you want us to give you credit for something which we do not necessarily in daily life experience as a significant improvement? So I think that is one of the main factors, notwithstanding the fact that in response, you have the new parties which claim, based on a radical populist narrative, we would be the true alternative, coming themselves from an basically ANC history.
Mm.
But generally speaking, there is a huge degree of frustration concerning non-delivery, failed this. And it's something that former liberation movements as governments have missed out. They gradually start to realize that struggle credentials are not any longer the one and only reference point which justifies to be in political power.
Mm.
Need to deliver. And if you do not deliver, the electorate will say that's enough. South Africa and Namibia remain the two most unequal countries in the world when it comes to the skewed income distribution.
Mm.
To that extent, you could even say that white minority rule in terms of the distribution of privileges has not ended.
Mm.
And the younger generations, they are aware of that. And if they are not part of the few who managed through the political transitions to be uplifted into the new black middle class status, they have all the reason to vote for other parties, or as it is the case, especially in South Africa, not to vote at all any longer, because they say there is no option we have. So that for them, a political act and decision is not to vote. And I think this is the turning point we have reached in basically all of those countries where former liberation movements are the governments. If you look at the MPLA in Angola, if you look at Frelimo in Mozambique, if you look at ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe, the only ultimate instrument on which they can base their continued staying in power is violence.
I think, unfortunately, those days of charismatic leadership and of youth and the electorate being actually, enticed and engaged by that charismatic leadership is over simply due to, well, as you say, an absence of delivery of services. I recently had the privilege of meeting Omar van Reenen, who has been an activist for LGBTQ rights and safety in Namibia. More recently, the new government has actually enacted the Marriage Act, which excludes members of the LGBTQ population from having the same marriage and adoption rights as heterosexual couples. Not only that, the situation of security, the amounts of hate crimes and violence against the LGBTQ population in Namibia is concerning. There's a vast difference in the post-apartheid recognition of minority rights, I would say, between South Africa and Namibia. Why do you think there is such a stark difference, and what will it take to actually ensure a democracy that is equal to all?
You raise another very sad example of the limits to liberation. Well, first of all, the Namibian constitution was drafted and adopted in 1990. The South African constitution was adopted after the elections in 1994, and it took even a few more years until the new constitution was officially in place. That few years time difference resulted in the South African constitution being more up to date than the Namibian constitution, in the sense that LGBTI plus rights were explicitly recognized in the South African constitution. That has not been the case in the Namibian constitution. A lot has happened in those few years in the global discourse on same-sex relations and the right to otherness and the self-determination in terms of sexual identity. So that is one significant difference. But the Namibian constitution has enshrined fundamental civil liberties and rights. And same-sex relations were officially prohibited by law, but tolerated in independent Namibia all the time. We even had gay parades in Namibia, in the public, in Windhoek, in Swakopmund, with no interference. Actually, an Afrobarometer survey some few years ago had as a result that close to 70% of Namibian respondents said they do not mind at all if their neighbor is homosexual.
Mm.
That's remarkable.
Mm.
What then happened was a judgment by the Constitutional Court, the Supreme Court in Namibia, 2 years ago, where two married same-sex couples went to the Supreme Court because they got married abroad but live in Namibia, and their same-sex partners had not the same rights as foreign spouses of intersex couples. And the Supreme Court ruled, and that was confined to two individual cases, that this is unfair discrimination, which is not in the spirit of the Namibian constitution, and those same-sex partners should have exactly the same rights and obligations as any other foreign spouses living with their partners, Namibian partners in Namibia. Now you would assume that was just an adjustment long overdue. Instead, it sparked total homophobic responses by basically all parties in the Namibian National Assembly, by the churches, by you name who. It provoked an increase of homophobic violence, and it motivated a bill passed in record time in the National Assembly, which had this result you already referred to, that the Marriage Act in Namibia was changed to an extent that it now discriminates. And actually, one could now ask the question if such a law, which was enacted by the president in late 2024, is not in contempt of court, because it basically is correcting a ruling by the Constitutional Court. It's a very sad experience, and the LGBTI groups in Namibia face a really uphill battle. And it's another one of the sad examples of what I call the limit to liberation. None of it threatens the dominant sexual preferences. None of them demands others to follow their preferences. The impression is created, which is wrong, that this is a Western imported habit, cultural imperialism, which denies long oral history of indigenous communities, that same-sex preferences and sexual identities were in existence before colonial times.
Exactly.
They are in complete denial. And they are actually not aware, or even at least close their eyes, that the homophobic discourses are a priority by white US American sectarian churches who finance the homophobic movements in Kenya and other African countries. And in the name of African culture and patriotism, same-sex relations are objected and fought against, not being aware that this is a cultural struggle which is motivated and supported by white supremacists. It's crazy. It's totally crazy.
Namibia has its first female president, former freedom fighter Nandi Naitweta. What are your thoughts on this, and how do you think her appointment could potentially influence Namibia and the region?
The election of Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah, who is fondly called Triple N, a long overdue move. I mean, SWAPO had a pioneering role. They accepted more than 10 years ago a so-called CIPRA principle, that on the national list for members to be elected for parliament, every second place has to be a woman, which means that half of the members of parliament elected for SWAPO are women.
Mm.
And it's widely recognized and celebrated globally because in terms of statistics, one of the most gender equal countries on that level of political representation is Namibia. It's slightly misleading because it does not necessarily mean that the Namibian women in politics stand their case. They very often still comply with traditional roles allocated to women.
Mm.
I wouldn't call them subservient. They are more conscious and confident in the meantime, but they still adjust their mindsets to a male-dominated society.
Mm.
And Triple N, Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah, reproduces part of that traditional mindset. She is anti-abortionist. She is homophobic. And while she represented Namibia at the Cairo conference where we signed the reproductive rights, I say we because I was a member of that delegation then, which I'm very proud of. Now I'm bragging, sorry, but
No.
Namibia is actually not living up to that ratification of reproductive rights.
Mm.
And that means that with the first female president as of March 2025, it does not necessarily mean a more feminist policy.
Mm.
I give you one small example. There was a notion submitted that sanitary pads should be exempted from value-added tax in the shops. That notion was dismissed with the argument that those women who can afford to buy sanitation pads can also afford to pay value-added tax. That is Namibian reality today.
It's frustrating. If you look at the classification of sanitary pads worldwide, in most countries, it's considered a luxury good, which is insane. I believe Scotland is the only country that has now made sanitary pads completely free for all women, which is a step forward. But unfortunately, here, moving forward, for the past year, we've witnessed the most documented genocide in Gaza, in which different players have gotten involved. South Africa has brought charges of genocide to the ICJ against the state of Israel, backed by several countries of the global south. The German government has been, however, a vehement supporter of Israel and has joined Israel in its legal proceedings. The Namibian government last year responded quite strongly, calling out the German government for its lack of recognition of the Nama and Herero genocide. What are your thoughts on international recognition of genocides, and particularly the recognition of the Namibian genocide and Germany's current involvement and support of the genocide in Gaza?
What we witness in Gaza today is a setback to the general global discussion on genocide. It's a total flagrant violation and misinterpretation of the slogan, "Never Again," which was articulated by survivors of the concentration camps in Germany. Never again is misinterpreted as basically a free for Israel's government. In the name of the Holocaust and the victims of the Holocaust, they justify new forms of genocidal warfare against other people. And if you dare to criticize that and call it by the name it deserves, or call the Israeli policy apartheid, you are immediately classified as anti-Semitic. To the extent that those Jewish people in Israel, in other parts of the world, who criticize the government policy of Israel as apartheid and criticize the war in Gaza as genocidal, are labeled as self-hating anti-Semitic Jews.
Yeah.
This is a monstrosity of misinterpretation of the meaning "never again." And the responses to the South African claim at the International Court of Justice, supported among others by Namibia, show just how the world has degenerated in new global power relations, which give a SH ... to fundamental human rights.
Mm.
We have lost all the basic criteria for a moral compass.
The new Trump administration has cut all funding, including crucial humanitarian aid, particularly to the global south and within the African context. Beyond this, the administration has actually taken a diplomatic turn on South Africa, claiming unsafety and injustice towards the white Afrikaner minority in South Africa due to the Land Expropriation Act recently passed, undoubtedly in response to Pretoria taking Israel to the ICJ. Now, what are your thoughts on these claims, and how do you think this will change the economic and diplomatic landscape, not only for South Africa, but for other countries affected?
We live in interesting times, and actually I follow with quite some curiosity what this splendid isolation policy of "Make America Great Again" will have as an impact on the realignment and global reshuffling of power relations. Stopping US aid is a classical case of shooting in your own foot.
Mm.
The US abandons its soft power and forces recipient countries to rethink on whom to trust and rely upon. That's a significant point of departure. South Africa is a special case, as you pointed out, not least given the role that Elon Musk is playing now, coming from Pretoria's Boys Hide, and now sitting next to Trump in the Oval Office. There's another one, Peter Thiel, who was raised in South Africa and in Swakopmund, among others, where he went to school. So those two, adding to the white supremacist arrogance of power, which is another shoot in the leg when it comes to the refugee status they are generously offering the Afrikaans-speaking whites in South Africa. And I think it dawns on them that this is a bad move. And it's very interesting to see that they are in South Africa desperately rowing back and say, well, none of us wants to be a refugee in the US. I mean, why would you? Would you want to abandon your privileged life in luxury and affluence to move to the US, where you can't afford to play on the next golf field, which you do all the time in South Africa? So it's really also interesting for me to follow some of the responses on X, the former Twitter, where even Afrikaans-speaking whites are desperate to say, no, 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 that's a misunderstanding, actually. Okay, we might complain, but strictly speaking, everything is relative. And so these are components which actually indicate the shift of affairs, also in global policies. It reminds South Africa where the interests are when it comes to trade relations. If, for example, this African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, is unilaterally ended for South Africa, or maybe even generally in September this year, when this act needs to be extended, then it would be another blow, not only to South Africa, but also to other African countries who benefit from preferential access to the US-American market. Now, that means you have to reassess how you position yourself in the world, which not necessarily means to enter closer ties with Russia. It would give certainly a comparative advantage to China with its soft power policy since 20 years on the entire African continent. But it might also introduce a realignment with the growing divide between the US and Europe, which we witness at the moment. So all of a sudden, we might in the near future see that global power centers emerge not only in Washington and Beijing and Moscow, but also in Brussels. So that the alignment between Western Europe and the USA is actually coming to an end. And there is a realignment, let's say hypothetically, between Western Europe, Canada, Mexico, other countries like South Africa, which would not necessarily imply that you join a political bloc. You can do that under the strategy of remaining non-aligned. BRICS is basically playing the non-alignment card, especially by China. China has always had an open policy towards Western countries. That's the contrast to Russia. And I think the decisive element in BRICS is China and not Russia. And to some extent, India, even if India and China don't like each other. But India pursues already a similar policy. They are friends with whoever promises them some advantages. So they don't need to collaborate with different regimes with very different political ideologies. And that might be a new exit option, which then would mean that the USA isolates itself more than they think, and they don't get a lot out of imposing tariffs on other countries, because these other countries, they close the ranks. And all of a sudden, you would have a new alignment between Western Europe, Canada, Mexico, and BRICS countries like South Africa and like India. And all of a sudden, then, the one big power that is out in the dark is the USA. So that's playing with scenarios, but at the moment, I think it's very interesting to see, and I don't think it's too far-fetched that this global realignment shakes up relations in the world much more fundamentally than Trump, in his arrogance of power, thinks it would do.
I mean, I'm hoping, from a global South perspective, that this will really force us to not be so dependent on one or a few countries and to actually economically and diplomatically diversify just for our own safety and our own security.
Exactly.
Moving forward, do you see there's been a lot of criticism in the way that the German government has managed the recognition of the genocide in Namibia, as well as the inclusion of the Nama and Herero with regards to reparations and payments. Adding on to this, do you see double standards in the application of democracy, human dignity, and international law, as well as the value of life? And why is it acceptable for some violence to be recognized and some to not?
Double standards have prevailed all the time. They remain an integral part of global policy, actually an integral part of domestic policy as well. I mean, I don't think there is any given society which has totally eradicated double standards.
Mm.
It's always a question who holds the power of definition. And then the next question, how is the power of definition applied? We had, as one of the recent examples, the homophobic response of the Namibian government and parliament to the ruling of the Supreme Court. That's an example of domestic double standards.
Mm.
They are reproduced in global double standards. We talked about never again and the misinterpretation of never again, that it's basically exclusively applied as a right to Israel and the Jews, that they can basically fight others with genocidal practices under the motto of never again, which basically means it is repeated instead of never again. Similar double standards apply when it comes to this recognition of colonial genocide by the Germans, because they made a caveat that they said from today's perspective, meaning genocide is not genocide. It's genocide from today's perspective, which has a legal implication. It has not the same consequences as if it would be applied after the Genocide Convention was adopted by the United Nations, which is logically a contradiction, because it would mean, following the same argument, that the Holocaust was a genocide from today's perspective. Now, I dare you to say that in Germany, as I just did it. Then you would be, again, anti-Semitic. But that's exactly the point. So you treat similar events in history with different criteria and measurements. The term is intertemporality, where the argument is, by some in the legal profession, you can't judge what happened 100 years ago by the criteria which are valid today. But that intertemporal principle is ignored by the same Germany, because they did not say, well, the Nazi regime had their own laws, which we have to respect. No, it was unjust, and they condemn it. They have acted to laws that were in existence in East Germany, the German Democratic Republic. Now, if intertemporality is applied, then those were laws which were legitimate in that system. But West Germany then said no, they were not legitimate. So why then should colonial laws, which justified the extermination of indigenous communities, be legitimate? While at the same time, already then, lawyers were disputing the terra nullius apology, saying, well, those natives, quote unquote, they were not civilized and you couldn't apply the same criteria to them as human beings, meaning there was a justification to exterminate them. That was already then disputed. It was not the dominant view, but that view existed, which is an important reminder that at any given time, there were people who were able to differ between justice and injustice, even if they were not the ones who were holding the power of definition. So these double standards are also reproduced in that declaration, which, by the way, after 10 years since the negotiations started, seems to be put to rest without being signed. And the only lesson that 10 years offer is how not to reconcile.
So, reflecting on your extraordinary journey, you were kind enough to share some images, some photos of your time. So, the first image that you sent me was taken on Independence Day in Namibia, and it's a poem. Now that the Namib sings, and that the tear of the Katura child is washed away, who will keep the fire burning? The revolution continues, forward to socialism, viva the people.
It's a poster I saw on Independence Day in the old contract worker compound, which was dilapidated, where some of the leftovers had been used by local NGOs. That compound doesn't exist any longer. It was brought down, and now there is a shopping center. Again, it's something how you should not deal with the history of resistance. And that poster, until the very day, serves for me as a reminder that the struggle continues. Who will keep the fire burning? And that is something for you and your fellow generation in the African Youth Security Network and elsewhere, that we pass on the torch. The struggle is not over. And it's maybe to some extent an admission of defeat. That's how I perceive it. Looking at social realities today in South Africa and Namibia, it's feeling like a defeat for me because I believed in values I do not see realized and implemented today. But it's also a kind of an obligation I see in folks like you and others to take the torch and carry on with the fight for human dignity, for social justice, for fairness, and for equality.
I think it's so interesting that you use that rhetoric with all that in this context, the rhetoric with the torch is taken, because I think in a lot of post-colonial or resistant contexts, it's utilized a lot, whether it's, the incendiary march in Cuba. The second photo that you were kind enough to share is in December 1980 with Mr. Nangolo Mumba and the late Mr. Shumbe, I believe. Can you tell me a bit more about that image?
That image was taken in December 1989. It was after I was in Namibia to be of assistance for the accommodation of the returnees, those who returned from exile. And I was tasked by the Lutheran World Federation to assist the local churches who had a returnee compartment. And Schombe was the SWAPO resident representative in West Germany. He was basically my res rep in the second half of the 1980s. And Nangolo Bumba, who happens to be the interim head of state in Namibia for the period between February 2024 and March 2025, was my counterpart in SWAPO in the early 1980s, when we together were drafting a social studies textbook for SWAPO schools in exile and church schools in Namibia, which, by the way, was the reason why in 1975 I was in Namibia, to look into the opportunities. How can you establish education which does not reproduce Bantu education? And the funny coincidence is that having this photo when we celebrated that I would return to Germany at that time before finally returning to Namibia, that photo was taken at a small party we had for my farewell. And I now looked at it. The late Chombe is not any longer among us, but Nangolo Bumba now happened to end up as the country's fourth president. And I thought this is funny how things play out. You never thought would happen. So
Mm.
there is a photo where the current president of Namibia has his arm around my shoulder. I'm not so sure how he would respond to that photo if you show it to him today.
The second photo that you shared was of you at a festival. I believe it's the Witboy Nama in Gideon.
Oh yeah, that was also in 1989. The Nama at Gibeon, who had this legendary resistance fighter, Hendrik Witboy, who was killed in his 80s in battle against the Germans in 1905. They have an annual festival in which they celebrate the anti-colonial struggle of their forefathers and foremothers since the beginning of the 20th century. And I had the opportunity to attend that in September 1989 for the first time after returning to Namibia, which happened in August 1989 that I was able to return after 14 years. And it was a very touching and moving event because when we came to Namibia, my mother and my stepfather were on a farm in southern Namibia where many of the farm laborers were from the Nama community. And at that event in 1989, I saw a group of elders sitting there, and it was obvious from their body language that they were talking about me. So I got curious and I moved there. And then they pointed out that they remember me as a juvenile on that farm in southern Namibia in 1967-68. That was so moving. And they
Wow.
did it with friendliness, with joy meeting me again, being happy that I came to visit this annual event. So that is actually a photo which also has a great emotional value for me, remembering that exchange.
You shared another image of you with Anton Lebowski at a seminar in West Germany in Bonn.
Well, Anton was the one who paid the highest price for his personal decision to join the ranks of SWAPO.
Mm.
He was born 2 or 3 years after me. We are basically the same age group. He joined SWAPO a couple of years after me. He always felt guilty because he became the most prominent white SWAPO member and was often mistaken as the first white SWAPO member. So he sometimes, in our informal interactions, almost apologized by saying, "I'm so sorry, but it's not me who I know that I'm not the first one." But Anton deserves to be credited as the ultimate personification that the struggle was not between black and white. He was a human rights lawyer. He supported political prisoners in Namibia. He never left Namibia. And he was assassinated in September 1989, almost on the day when Steve Biko was killed many years before. And he paid with his life for his convictions that Namibia deserves to be ruled by the people living there under a government which is elected by them. So for me, Anton is the embodiment of a willingness to live up to the values you consider essential, even if it comes at risking your life and paying with your life for it.
The last two images that you shared, two of them were celebrations on main streets on the Day of Independence. And the last one that you shared was when you celebrated the election results. So I wanted to just ask you, how was that feeling of Independence Day, the pictures that you took on Independence Day? And what was sort of the feeling when you got the election results? Can you just tell me a bit more about those images?
Well, the election results were made known in late November 1989. That was months before Independence Day, where I took the photo of the poster, which was 21st March 1990. Oh, the memories of the announcement of the election results, they are just, until today, emotionally overwhelming. A dream came true. A dream which, as we discussed, was not fully implemented. But at that time, we thought, now we are writing history. Now we enter a new chapter of Namibia, where people live in freedom, where people become equal, where they share the wealth of the country, where they respect each other. The black and white photo was taken when the election result was announced, and it was taken at the then provisional headquarters of SWAPO, with the whole leadership of SWAPO standing there and preparing for the press conference, knowing that they are the elected next government of the independent Republic of Namibia. And the two photos celebrating on what was then still Kaiser Street, which is now Independence Avenue, they were just the joyous hours when we really were able, without being afraid of police interfering and repressing us, standing there and witnessing in disbelief the policemen, that we could demonstratively celebrate, blacks and whites and all colors of people, that we are one, united in this feeling. Sorry, it's just too much to bring back that memory, that feeling that we will be one nation in the future. And thinking back to that moment, being confronted with the harsh realities of the day, is not only a moment of joy, it's actually also a moment of sadness, because we have not been able to live up to that feeling. Sorry for that, but
No, no, I mean, look, I think it's, for me at least, it's a really good to see that there are still people that genuinely care, that genuinely have empathy, with regards to social struggles, particularly men, particularly white people, because unfortunately, the world that we live in has become so desensitized and dehumanized to the suffering of so many people. So I find your reaction to this and to my question incredibly powerful and beautiful, because it shows that you genuinely care and that this means something to you. And this is so important. So thank you very much for opening up. And dear Henning, on behalf of the African Youth Security Network and on behalf of youth all around the world, I would like to sincerely thank you for your never-ending dedication and hard work and advocacy and continued empowerment for young people and for people of color and for people who are engaged in the struggle worldwide. I really appreciate you taking the time to tell your story and to inspire the next generation of change makers. Thank you very much.
Bia, I am grateful to you. As I mentioned at the beginning, one should not be credited for trying to behave like a decent human being. But your interest in my efforts to behave like a decent human being shows that you are not prejudiced, that you are willing to give room for the thought that even old white men can try to behave like decent human beings. And for that, I'm very grateful.
You know, I think more than anything, we need to stop fighting each other and we need to work together, regardless of race, creed, age, gender, sexual orientation. So I'm really happy to have heard your experience. So thank you so much.